The dust rose slow and heavy that morning, the kind of dust that does not settle easy, the kind that gets into your lungs and sits there like grief, like the weight of a season gone wrong, like the particular silence of a house where a man used to be and is no longer. And Martha Calloway stood at the edge of her porch with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and she did not drink it. She only held it, because holding something warm, even when it is no longer warm, is better than holding nothing at all. And she looked out across the yard where the old mare stood near the fence post, the horse her husband Dale had called Bella. Not because she was beautiful in any conventional way, because she was not. She was a plain brown quarter horse with a white patch above her left eye and ribs that showed a little more than they should have this time of year. But Dale had said beauty is not a thing you see, it is a thing you feel, and every time I see this horse I feel something good, and Martha had laughed at him for that, the way you laugh at a man you love when he says something that is either very stupid or very wise and you have not yet decided which. And now Dale was gone, 18 months in the ground out behind the property near the old oak tree, and Martha had not laughed much since, and the coffee was cold, and the dust was rising, and the bankman was coming on Friday. She had known this day was coming the way you know a storm is coming when the sky turns that particular shade of yellow-green in the afternoon. You know it, but you keep hoping the wind will shift, you keep hoping something will change, and nothing had changed, and Friday had come, and the bankman, whose name was Gerald Holt, had driven out from Redemption in his black buggy with his ledger book and his thin mouth and his way of looking at everything on the property as if he were already calculating what it would fetch at auction. And he had sat across from her at the kitchen table where Dale used to eat his breakfast, and he had told her in that flat, careful voice that the note was due, that the extension the bank had given her after Dale passed was the last extension they could offer, that the bank was not in the business of charity, that he was sorry for her situation. And she had looked at his thin mouth saying these words, and she had thought, "You are not sorry, you have never been sorry for anything in your life. Sorry requires the ability to feel something, and I do not think you have ever felt anything." But she had not said this because Gerald Holt held the paper that said whether she and her 12-year-old son Eli kept this land or lost it, and so she had thanked him for coming, and she had shown him to the door, and she had stood on the porch and watched his buggy roll back down the road toward town, and then she had walked to the fence where Bella stood, and she had pressed her forehead against the horse's neck and breathed in that warm animal smell, and she had let herself cry for exactly 4 minutes. She counted, because she had decided early on after Dale died that she was allowed to cry, but she was not allowed to disappear into it. She was allowed 4 minutes, and then she had to stand back up and figure out what was next. What was next was the Redemption Saturday auction. It was held every third Saturday in the yard behind the feed store. Livestock mostly, sometimes equipment, sometimes furniture from estates, and it drew men from 20 miles in every direction, ranchers and farmers and traders and the occasional speculator from the railroad. And Martha had gone to talk to a man named Hector Baines, who ran the auction, and he had looked at Bella with the practiced eye of a man who had valued 10,000 animals, and he had said, "The horse will bring you something. Maybe not what you are hoping, but something." And she had said, "What do you think?" And he had scratched his jaw and said, "Depending on the day, depending on who shows up, maybe $60, maybe $80. And she had nodded because $80 was not enough to pay the note, but it was enough combined with what she had in the tin box under the floorboard to come close. Close enough that maybe Gerald Holt with his thin mouth could be persuaded that close was good enough for now. And she had told Hector yes, put Bella in the Saturday auction, and she had walked home, and she had not cried, not even 4 minutes, because she had made her decision, and crying about a decision you have already made is a waste of time. Dale had told her a lot of things that turned out to be true. Eli did not know about the auction. She had not told him because Eli was 12 and he had already lost his father, and she was not going to tell him he was about to lose Bella too until she absolutely had to. And maybe she would not have to. Maybe there would be some other answer that presented itself between now and Saturday. And there was not, and Saturday morning came gray and cool, and she told Eli she needed to take Bella to town for the farrier, which was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, and she told it anyway because she was his mother, and protecting him from pain for one more morning was worth the small cost of a lie. And Eli had hugged Bella's neck and said, "Give her a carrot for me," and Martha had said, "I will." And she had led the horse down the road toward Redemption with a rope in her hand and the cold coffee feeling in her chest that had been there since Dale died and had never fully left. The auction yard was already filling up when she arrived. Men in hats and dusty coats standing in clusters, the smell of livestock and sawdust and coffee from the pot someone always set up near the gate. And Hector Baines had come over and taken Bella's lead rope and written her number in his book and told Martha to wait near the fence when Bella's turn came up. And Martha had found a place by the fence and stood there with her arms crossed and watched the morning's auction unfold with the particular kind of attention of a person who is waiting for something they dread. There were 6 horses before Bella. A gray gelding that went for $42 to a man from out past the canyon. A young roan stallion that drew some competition and went for 90. A pair of work horses sold together for 110. And then some smaller lots, a mule, a pony, and then Hector was leading Bella out and saying number 14, a quarter horse mare, 7 years old, good temperament, known to be a solid trail horse, and Martha watched the men in the crowd look at Bella with their calculating eyes, and she pressed her arms tighter across her chest, and she did not look away from the horse because Bella was looking back at her across the crowd with those dark calm eyes, and Martha thought, she knows, animals always know, and she was sorry, she was genuinely sorry in a way that Gerald Holt would never understand. Hector started the bidding at $25. A heavy-set man near the front raised his hand for 30. Another man across the yard went to 35. The heavy-set man went to 40. There was a pause, and Martha's heart did what it had been doing since Friday, which was squeezing itself into a tight, unhappy shape. And then a third man she had not noticed before raised his hand and said 50. And the voice was quiet, but it carried. The way a voice carries when the man using it is not trying to impress anyone. And Martha looked toward the voice and saw a man standing at the far edge of the crowd near the water trough. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall and lean in the way of a man who has spent a long time outdoors doing physical work. Not thin from lack of eating, but spare in the way of someone who carries nothing he does not need. He wore a dark hat with the brim pulled low and a canvas coat that had seen considerable weather and boots that were worn but well kept. The boots of a man who takes care of his things. His face, what she could see of it from across the yard, was angular, maybe 40 years old, maybe older, with the kind of weathering that makes it difficult to be precise. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Bella. 50, Hector said, do I have 55? And the heavy-set man at the front hesitated and then nodded 55, and the tall man at the back said 60 without waiting for the count. And there was something in the way he said it that made the heavy-set man look at him and then look back at Bella and then shrug in the way a man shrugs when he has decided the animal is not worth the argument, and Hector said 60 going once, going twice, and Martha thought, please let someone else bid. Please let there be someone here today who has more money than sense and wants this horse badly enough to go to 80. But nobody moved, and Hector said sold, $60, to the gentleman in the back. Martha closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a count of 3. Then she opened them and went to find Hector to collect her money, because $60 was $60, and $60 combined with the 31 she had in the tin box was $91, and the note was $112, and she was still short, but maybe Gerald Holt with his thin mouth could be made to see reason. Maybe partial payment combined with a plan. Maybe she could take in washing, maybe she could sell something else. She was already running the numbers before she had even reached Hector's table, and she was so focused on the numbers that she almost walked directly into the tall man who was standing in her path. She stopped. He stopped. He was holding Bella's lead rope. Up close he was older than she had thought, maybe 45, with gray beginning at his temples and pale gray eyes that were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not quite recognition, not quite sympathy. Something more careful than either of those things. She said, excuse me, and moved to go around him. He said, ma'am, are you the one who brought this horse in today? She stopped again. She said, I am. He looked at her steadily, and then he looked at the horse and then back at her, and he said, this horse has been well kept. You can tell a lot about people by how they keep their animals. She did not know what to say to that, so she said, thank you, and moved to go around him again. He said, wait, please, and there was something in the please that was genuine, not a courtesy please but an actual asking. And she stopped because she was tired and $60 was not enough and she had nowhere important to be, and something about this man's voice suggested he was not the kind of person who said please without meaning it. She said, what is it? He said, I am going to ask you something and I would appreciate a straight answer, and then I will let you go about your business. Why are you selling this horse? She looked at him. She said, that is not your concern. He said, no ma'am, you are right, it is not, and he paused, and then he said, I am going to tell you something and I would ask you to hear me out before you say anything. Will you do that? She looked at him for a long moment. The auction yard was noise around them, men talking, another lot beginning, the smell of dust and animals, and this tall man with his gray eyes standing in the middle of it looking at her like she was the only thing in the yard that mattered, and she said, all right. He said, I know this horse. Not this horse specifically, but this kind of horse, this kind of care. And I know the look of a woman who is selling something she does not want to sell, and I have stood in that position myself, and I know what it costs, and I am not trying to embarrass you or make your situation harder. I bought this horse today, and I have the right to do what I like with her. And what I would like to do is give her back to you. Martha stared at him. She said, I beg your pardon. He said, I would like to give you back your horse. And I would like to give you the $60 as well. Not as a loan, he said, before she could say anything, not as something you owe me, just as a gift from one person to another person who could use it. And then I would like to ask you something, and you are free to say no. And if you say no, I will tip my hat and walk away, and you will never have to see me again if you prefer it that way. Martha stood very still. She had the feeling of a person who is being offered something she wants very badly and is therefore looking very hard for the reason it is a trap. Because things that are offered to a woman alone with a piece of land and a child are almost always traps. She had learned this, not bitterly but practically, the way you learn that a fence post that looks solid sometimes is not, and you should check before you lean your weight on it. She said, Who are you? He said, My name is Samuel Cole. Most people call me Sam. I run cattle up near the Arrowhead Range, been there about 4 years. Before that I was in a lot of other places that I will tell you about if you ever want to know. And before that I was married and my wife died of fever 6 years ago, and I have been on my own since, and I will be honest with you, being on your own for 6 years gets to feeling like something that needs addressing. He paused. He said, I am not practiced at saying things like that out loud, so I ask for your patience with the way this is coming out. Martha said, Are you saying what I think you are saying? He said, I do not know what you think I am saying, but I will say what I mean, and you can judge for yourself. I came to this auction today because I needed a trail horse, and I saw you standing at that fence watching this mare with an expression I recognized because I have worn that expression myself, and it is the expression of a person who is losing something that matters to them and is trying to be dignified about it. And I do not know you, I do not know your name or your situation or whether you would want anything to do with a man like me, but I know that I have not felt like introducing myself to a woman in 6 years, and today I felt like it, and I thought it was worth at least finding out if you would permit me to try. That is all. That is everything I am saying. The noise of the auction yard continued around them. A horse whinnied somewhere to the left. Bella stood quietly at the end of the lead rope, flicking her tail at a fly, entirely unbothered by the weight of the conversation happening around her. Martha said, My name is Martha Calloway. My husband died 18 months ago. I have a 12-year-old son named Eli. I have a property that is behind on its bank note, and $60 will not save it. I am telling you these things because you were straight with me, and I will be straight with you. I do not need to be rescued. I need a fair situation. He said, I am not interested in rescuing anyone. I have found in my experience that people who need rescuing are usually the ones who have been prevented from solving their own problems. What I am interested in is a fair situation. I believe that is the same thing you just said. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind picked up a little, pushing dust across the yard. She said, I am not going to make any decisions standing in an auction yard. He said, That is reasonable. She said, But you can come to Sunday supper if you want. I live 3 miles out on the North Road. It is the property with the blue gate. We eat at 6. He said, I will be there at 6. She said, Bring nothing. We have enough food. He said, All right. She said, And bring the $60. I am not taking the horse back without paying for her. He looked at her steadily, and something in the gray eyes shifted, something that might have been the beginning of a smile, and he said, I had a feeling you would say that. She took the lead rope from his hand and led Bella back through the yard toward the road home, and she did not look back because she was Martha Calloway and she did not look back. But she was aware with every step of the 60 feet between them that he was watching her go, and she was aware that she did not mind. The road home was 3 miles of packed dirt between scrub and sparse grass and the occasional stand of cottonwood, and Martha walked it the way she always walked it, steadily and without hurrying, with Bella plodding companionably beside her, and she talked to the horse the way she had always talked to her, quietly, not expecting answers, just the particular comfort of saying things out loud to a creature who will not judge you or repeat them to anyone. She said, I do not know what I just did. Bella snorted. She said, I know. I know. She said, His eyes are a strange color, like the sky looks when it has not decided yet whether to rain. She said, Dale would have liked him. That is either a recommendation or a warning. I cannot tell which. Bella's hooves made their steady sound on the dirt, and the afternoon light was coming in golden and long across the scrubland, and Martha walked and thought, and by the time she could see the blue gate at the end of the road she had not arrived at any conclusions, but she felt, strangely, lighter than she had felt in 18 months, as if something had shifted in the way a heavy thing shifts when someone else puts a hand on the other end of it, not taking it from you but sharing the weight, and She noticed the feeling with suspicion because she had learned to be suspicious of feelings that made things seem easier than they were, but she noticed it anyway and decided not to argue with it, not today. Eli was sitting on the porch when she came through the gate with Bella, and his face when he saw the horse was a thing she tucked away in her memory immediately, the way you tuck away the moments that are purely good, uncomplicated, unmarked by anything difficult, and he came down the steps at a run and threw his arms around Bella's neck and said, "You brought her back. I thought she was going to the farrier, and Martha said she was, and she is back now, and everything is fine, and only one of those three things was a lie, and it was a small one." She put Bella in the paddock and fed her and then went inside and stood in the kitchen and thought about Sunday. Sunday came with the quality of light that the territory sometimes produced in late spring, clear and bright with a blue so deep it looked painted. The kind of day that made it hard to believe anything could be wrong with the world even when you knew that plenty was, and Martha had been up since before dawn cooking the way she cooked when there was something worth cooking for, not the plain practical cooking of a woman feeding herself and a child and getting on with things, but the real cooking, the slow cooking, the kind that filled the house with smells that stayed in the walls, and Eli had come down to find cornbread in the pan and a pot of beans with salt pork on the stove and a dried apple pie cooling on the windowsill, and he had said, "Who is coming to dinner?" And she had said, "A man I met at the auction," and Eli had looked at her with the particular sharp look of a 12-year-old who is paying more attention than you think he is paying, and he said, "What kind of man?" and she said, "The kind who tips his hat when he talks to you," and Eli had considered this and said, "All right," and gone out to do the morning chores, and she thought, he is so like his father, he knows when to ask questions and when to let things unfold. Sam Cole arrived at 5 minutes to 6, which was early enough to show respect and not so early as to be inconvenient, and he came on a big gray horse that was clearly well cared for, and he tied the horse at the post near the gate and came up the path carrying his hat in his hand. And Eli was sitting on the porch steps and looked up at the man and then looked at his mother in the doorway and then looked back at the man, and Sam stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at Eli and said, "You must be Eli." Eli said, "Yes, sir." Sam said, "I am Sam Cole. Your mother was kind enough to invite me to supper." Eli said, "She makes good cornbread." Sam said, "I was hoping for that." Eli looked at him a moment longer with that measuring 12-year-old look and then said, "You want to see the horse?" And Sam said, "I would like that very much." And Eli got up off the steps and led him around to the paddock, and Martha stood in the doorway and watched the tall man and the boy walk side by side across the yard toward Bella's paddock. And something happened in her chest that she did not immediately have a word for, and she went back inside and stirred the beans and added a little more salt. At supper Sam ate the way a man eats when the food is good and he is grateful for it, steadily and without excess, and he complimented the cornbread and meant it, and he asked Eli questions about the property and about school and about what he thought about horses, real questions, the kind that treated a 12-year-old as someone whose opinions were worth hearing, and Eli, who was cautious with strangers the way all children who have experienced loss become cautious, answered at first in the short, careful way of someone who is not yet sure whether to trust, and then by the second helping of beans was talking at his normal length, which was considerable, because Eli had his father's gift for language and his mother's directness, and when he got going on a topic he was interested in he was very good company. He talked about Bella. He talked about the way she had known, the spring before Dale got sick, that something was coming because horses know things, he said, people don't think they do but they do, and his father had told him that, and Sam had nodded seriously and said, "Your father was right. I have seen horses act in ways that suggest they understand a great deal more than they get credit for," and Eli had looked at him with those serious dark eyes and said, "How did you know about my father?" And Sam had said, "Your mother told me," and Eli had looked at his mother and she had looked back at him and he had looked back at his beans and said, "Oh." After supper Eli took himself off to bed without being told, which meant he was either tired or giving the adults room, and knowing Eli she suspected it was the latter, and she and Sam sat on the porch in the warm evening with the last of the pie between them and the stars coming out over the scrubland, and she told him about the banknote, the full picture of it, the number and what she had and how far short it fell, because she had decided during the cooking that she would rather be fully honest with this man up front and have him run or stay based on the truth of her situation rather than hold anything back and have it come out later like a stone you did not see in the road until you have already broken a wheel on it. He listened without interrupting. When she was done he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I have money. I have more than I need. I would like to help you settle the note." She said, "And what would that mean? What would you want for that?" He said, "Nothing that you would not freely give. I am not interested in buying anything from you, not your gratitude, not your company, not anything." If I help you settle the note, it is because you need it settled and I have the means to settle it, and the only thing I would ask is that you let me come back. If you find that you do not want me to come back, I will not come back, and the money is still yours, no strings and no conditions. I know that sounds like something a man says to get what he wants, and I cannot prove to you that it is not except by meaning it, which I do, and you will have to decide whether to believe me." She was quiet for a while. The night had the sound of crickets, and somewhere far off a coyote saying something urgent to the dark. She said, "I have to think about this." He said, "I know." She said, "I will need more than one supper to decide whether I trust you." He said, "I have time." She said, "Do you?" He said, "I have been patient for 6 years. I can be patient for as long as it takes." She said, "Come back next Sunday." He said, "I will." He came back the next Sunday and the Sunday after that, and by the 4th Sunday Eli was setting the extra place at the table without being asked. And by the 6th Sunday he and Sam were working together in the afternoon before supper to fix the section of fence on the east side that had been pulling loose from its post since the previous winter, and Martha had not had the strength or the knowledge of carpentry to address, and she watched them through the kitchen window, the tall man and the 12-year-old boy working together with the purposeful quiet of people who have found a shared task, passing tools and measuring and testing the fixed post by leaning their weight on it, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to look like, this is the thing that has been missing, not just the help with the fence but the quality of a person in the yard, a person who is there because they want to be there. On the 7th Sunday Sam brought a document from his bank and laid it on the table after supper and said the bank note on the Calloway property has been paid in full, and this is the receipt and she can do what she likes with it. Martha looked at the receipt for a long time without picking it up. Then she looked at Sam across the table and said, "I am not going to let this turn into something I owe you." He said, "I know." She said, "That means if this does not work out between us, you do not get to hold this over me." He said, "If it does not work out between us, the money is gone, and I will consider it the cost of having had the chance to find out, and that is the end of it as far as I am concerned." She looked at him. She said, "I believe you." He said, "I am glad." She picked up the receipt and folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and said, "I will think about whether I want you to keep coming to Sunday supper." He said, "All right." She said, "I think I do." He said, "I was hoping you would say that." Eli came in from the porch where he had been sitting at a careful distance listening to everything and pretending not to listen and said, "Are you going to keep fixing the fence because the north section needs work too?" And Sam said, "Yes, if that is all right." And Eli said, "It is all right with me," and looked at his mother, and she looked back at him and said, "It is all right with me too." That was April. By June Sam was coming not just on Sundays but on Thursday afternoons as well, riding out from his place near the Arrowhead Range with tools or lumber or simply himself. And there was always something to do on the Calloway property because Dale had been sick for a year before he died, and the property had the particular quality of a place where a capable pair of hands has been absent for a season longer than it should have been, small problems compounding into larger ones the way they do when there is nobody to catch them early, and Sam caught them steadily and without comment, the way he did most things. Eli watched all of this with the careful attention of a boy who has been the man of the house since he was 10, and is not quite sure whether to be relieved to have that weight lifted or to feel he is losing something by having it taken. One afternoon in early July he was helping Sam repair the paddock gate and he said, out of nowhere, without preamble, "Do you love my mother?" And Sam had set down his hammer and looked at the boy directly and said, "Yes, I do." And Eli said, "She has not said anything to me about that." And Sam said, "That is because it is hers to say when she is ready and not mine to announce." And Eli considered this and said, "She talks to Bella. Did you know that? She tells Bella things." And Sam said, "I had guessed that." And Eli said, "She used to talk to my dad that way." Sam said nothing, only looked at the boy steadily. And Eli said, "I think you should know that." Sam said, "I am glad you told me." Eli picked up his hammer and went back to work, and Sam picked up his hammer and went back to work, and between them the conversation was done, and both of them understood what had been said in it. Martha came to her decision not in a dramatic moment but in the ordinary quiet of an August morning when she was in the paddock brushing Bella and Sam was riding in through the blue gate, and she watched him dismount and tie his horse and come across the yard with his unhurried walk, and she thought, clearly and without any performance or confusion, "I want this to continue. Not in a desperate way, not in the way of someone who needs saving, but in the simple and serious way of a person who has looked at something long enough to know it is true and good and worth having." She wanted him to keep coming through that gate. She wanted him at the supper table. She wanted him here for the fencing and the roof and the long evenings on the porch and whatever came after those things. She finished brushing Bella and let herself out of the paddock and walked toward Sam, And he stopped walking and watched her come with those gray eyes that she had come to know well enough to read. And she stopped in front of him and said, "I have been thinking." He said, "About what?" She said, "About whether I want things to stay as they are." He said, "And?" She said, "I do not want things to stay as they are." He looked at her carefully. He said, "In which direction?" She said, "Forward." Something in his face changed, not dramatically. This was not a man who did things dramatically. But something shifted and settled, and she recognized it because she felt the same thing happening in her own chest. The particular feeling of a thing that has been uncertain becoming certain. A weight that was not unpleasant but was present becoming something else, something lighter and more solid at the same time, which sounds like a contradiction but is not. He said, "I would like that very much." She said, "I know." He said, "Is there something I should be doing?" She said, "You should probably speak to Eli first. Not to ask his permission, he is 12, but because he deserves to know what is happening from you and not just from me." He said, "I will talk to him this afternoon." She said, "Good." And then she went back to the house because she had bread to start, and she had said what she meant to say, and everything after this was a matter of time and patience and the particular ordinary work of building something, which was the same whether you were building a fence or a life. You started with what you had, and you worked steadily, and you checked what you built regularly to make sure it was sound, and you fixed what needed fixing before it became something you could not fix. And she thought she could do that. She thought Sam Cole could do that. She thought Eli would be all right. She thought Bella would be all right. She thought the Blue Gate and the property 3 miles out on the North Road and the tin box under the floorboard that was no longer a thing she needed to count every night would be all right. Sam talked to Eli that afternoon while they were working on the north fence section that Eli had mentioned in June and had been on the list ever since. He did not make a speech of it, which was right because Eli did not need a speech. He needed a straight conversation with a man who respected him enough to have it plainly. And Sam told him that he had spoken to his mother and they had agreed that they were going to move forward together, and that nothing about this was meant to replace his father. His father was his father and nobody was going to be pretending otherwise, and that what it did mean was that Sam intended to be here on this property and in this family if Eli was willing to have him. Eli did not say anything for a moment. He was driving a post with the kind of focus that can sometimes be a way of buying time, and Sam waited because he had learned that Eli's silences were not empty, they were working silences, the silence of a person who is thinking something through before they speak. Eli said, "Are you going to want me to call you something?" Sam said, "Whatever feels natural to you. You do not have to call me anything in particular." Eli said, "Eli." Sam said, "What?" Eli said, "My name is Eli." He said it the way his mother sometimes said things, plainly and with something underneath the plainness, and Sam recognized it because he had been listening to Martha Calloway say things that way for 5 months now, and he had learned to hear what was underneath, and what was underneath was, "I am telling you my name because you are going to need it because we are going to know each other well enough that the name matters." Sam said, "I know your name, Eli." Eli said, "I know you do." He picked up his end of the fence rail and held it in place, and Sam drove the nail, and they worked until the light started to go, and then they went in for supper. Kid. The supper that evening was not different from other suppers except that something had settled around the table. Some negotiation that had been running quietly under all the previous suppers had completed itself, and they sat and ate and talked about the fence and about the roan mare Sam had sold last week and about whether Eli was going to try for the fall school arithmetic competition and about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, and afterwards Martha washed the dishes and Eli dried them and Sam stacked them in the cupboard the way he had learned she kept them, and the kitchen had the particular quality of a room where people are comfortable with each other, at ease in the small domesticities, not performing anything, just present. When Eli had gone to bed and the kitchen was quiet, Sam and Martha sat on the porch in the August dark, and the night was warm and full of the sounds of the land settling into itself, and she said, "How did it go?" And he said, "I think it went all right," and she said, "He is a serious boy," and he said, he has had reason to be," and she said, "Yes," and they were quiet for a while, and then he said, "I have something I want to ask you," and she said, "All right," and he said, "I want to ask you properly," and he turned to look at her in the dark, and she looked back at him, and he said, "Martha Calloway, I would like to marry you if you will have me, and I will tell you everything I know about myself if you want to know it, and I will listen to everything you know about yourself if you want to tell it, and I will work every day to make sure this place and this family is sound, and I will fix what needs fixing before it becomes unfixable, and I will never try to take the place of anyone who came before me. I will only try to be what I am, which is a man who is very glad he went to that auction on that particular Saturday in April." Martha was quiet for a long moment. The stars were thick overhead, the kind of thick you only get far from town, and somewhere Bella moved in her paddock, a quiet sound, steady and unhurried. She said, "You are going to have to learn to be wrong sometimes, because I am sometimes wrong and it will not work if only one of us can be wrong." He said, "I have been wrong before and expect to be wrong again." She said, "Eli is going to need to be part of things. He has been part of things since he was 10, and you cannot uninclude a person who has learned to be included." He said, "I would not want to." She said, "And I am not going to stop talking to Bella." He said, "I would not ask you to." She said, "Then yes. Yes, Samuel Cole, I will marry you." He reached over and took her hand in his and held it, not with any performance, just held it steady and warm, the way you hold something that matters to you. And they sat on the porch in the August dark, and the night went on around them, and Bella moved quietly in her paddock, and the stars were thick and the land was still, and Martha Calloway thought, "This is what it feels like when something is right, not perfect, right? Which is a better thing than perfect, because you can build on right, you can work with right, you can take right and make something lasting out of it." And she held onto his hand and felt the weight in her chest that had been there since Dale died ease. Not disappear. It would never entirely disappear. Grief does not disappear. It becomes part of the architecture of a person. But it eased, and she thought that was enough, that was more than enough. That was everything she had been hoping for when she stood at the fence with cold coffee in her hands, watching the dust rise slow and heavy that morning that now felt like it belonged to a different chapter of her life. And it did, and this was the new chapter, and the dust could rise as high as it lee.